Scottish Government spends £272 per person more on social security than the Westminster Government spends in England. In this video, I'm going to explain how the Scottish Government does this, and just as importantly, I will explain why England's government doesn't match this expenditure. Now, if the Westminster Government were to match Scotland's spending on support for the poorest in society, it would have to spend £15,691,761,600. Now, given the constitutional arrangements of the UK, the Scottish Government has to mitigate cuts made across England. If it doesn't want these cuts to affect people in Scotland, it has to find the money within its current budget. It can either increase taxation or reduce spending on another area in Scotland. It only has these two choices, and yet it somehow manages to take a very different approach to fiscal austerity from Westminster. So how can the Scottish Government afford to spend this £272 per person more than Westminster? The simple reason is that the Scottish Government has different values and different ethical standards. There is clear blue water between how the Scottish and the UK governments view austerity. I will dig deep into the details, but it's really as simple as this. If the UK wanted to roll back on fiscal austerity, it could. And can you find any obvious evidence? That little nation atop of England already does it. Now, I have to make this clear, the last Conservative administration and the current Labour one continue to pile on the austerity policies in England, and they choose to do this. As a political economist, I am always on the lookout for the telltale signs that hint to the political ideas or the ideology underpinning economic decisions. What a government calls this type of support gives you an idea of what their value system says. Westminster calls this support welfare. The Scottish Government refers to support for the poorest in society as social security. The term welfare reflects the workhouse mentality shared by the Tories, Labour and the Liberal Democrats. The UK Government considers that poverty is for many people a choice, and that people should be able to find work to support themselves. It's a Victorian mindset that has been dismissed by most progressive governments in Europe. The social safety nets in many European countries are significantly stronger than in England. Scotland, despite its lack of economic power, is trying to close that gap. As Labour politicians turn on those on welfare, they cite economic reasons. So let's look at the economics. Government ministers failed to highlight that the Bank of England is keeping interest rates mercilessly high in a bid to slow down the economy. As the economy slows down, people lose their jobs and it becomes harder for those already on social security to find work. So the government punishes people for not finding work, while it supports an environment that creates more unemployment. If that wasn't bad enough, the government has paid out over £80 billion on interest payments on government bonds in the last 12 months. There's no welfare cap on payments that in the main go to the already wealthy. The economic argument just does not make sense. Find a job while the Bank of England makes people unemployed. There's no money available for social security, but 80 billion for the already wealthy. It's not really an economic argument, it's a political one. And in Scotland there is a political desire to find 1.5 billion extra for social security. And the majority of that money goes towards reducing child poverty. The 2025-26 Scottish budget listed eradicating child poverty as one of its 4 priorities. In a budget speech, John Swinney, Scotland's First Minister, went further. Eradicating child poverty is my top priority because I do not wish to condemn any young Scot to a life of disadvantage simply because of where they were born. To prove his commitment, the Scottish Government will mitigate Westminster's 2-child limit from 2026. The UK Government's 2-child limit was introduced at the height of fiscal austerity in April 2017. It applies to families with 3 or more dependent children, and it restricts means-tested state support via universal credit or child tax credit to a family's first 2 children. This will continue in England, but not in Scotland. The Scottish Government has decided that this welfare cut, as it would be called by the UK Government, is not fair, just or appropriate for Scotland. It jars with the government's values. Now, the Scottish Fiscal Commission calculated that mitigating the 2-child limit in 2026 will cost £155 million, with an annual payment per child in 2026 of £3,688, and it's going to support around 50,000 children. Oxford University Professor Dorling wrote, "The Scottish Government has done a great service to people living in the rest of the UK by demonstrating that it is possible and affordable to remove the effects of the 2-child limit that was imposed by the Conservative administration and is currently being continued under a Labour one." It's undeniable that increasing cash transfers to poor families will likely increase children's well-being and improve household financial stability. As well as deciding to mitigate UK austerity cuts, the Scottish Government has introduced its own payments to reduce child poverty. The Scottish Child Payment was introduced in 2021. Just over £100 a month for each eligible child is paid, and there is no limit to the number of children in a family who receive the payment. The idea that there's an upper limit on removing children from poverty is purely a Westminster idea. Reducing child poverty will likely prevent illness and decrease hospital and dental visits for those children. Poorer children are born with lower body weight and suffer higher levels of malnutrition throughout their childhood. They are often affected by maternal stress during pregnancy, which is often linked to financial worries. Increasing household wealth is linked to improved attendance, concentration and attainment at school. There is no better way for the government to spend money than reducing child poverty. But that £1.5 billion doesn't only go to protecting children from physical and mental effects of poverty. It's used to support other citizens that the government believes are in need of financial support. In 2013, the Scottish Government refused to implement the bedroom tax, a particularly horrible tax that reduced social security payments for those households that had a spare bedroom. According to Disability Rights UK, this was particularly painful for many disabled people who used that bedroom for care equipment or for carers. So is Professor Dorling correct? Can Westminster afford to remove the child benefit cap and other austerity policies and increase welfare spending? Well, of course it can. And the argument should be very simple. If Scotland can, then England must be able to do the same. You don't need to be an economist to just note the logic of that statement. The idea that part of the UK that doesn't create or issue any currency, doesn't collect the vast majority of taxes, and is unable to borrow more than £500 million each year can mitigate those social security cuts, but England can't, that just does not stand up to even the most meagre scrutiny. Arguing anything else is clearly preposterous. So the reason cannot be an economic one. It's political, or more precisely, ideological. There is a deep institutional support for welfare cuts in Westminster. To understand where policies come from and how they are supported, it proves very useful to study institutions. Within the UK's unique fiscal framework, these are a set of rules set up by the government to help them keep to spending and taxing plans, you will find a specific cap relating to welfare. Although fiscal rules are common, there is no other government in the world that includes a specific cap on welfare. Now, the coalition government introduced this rule in 2014, and Labour had the opportunity to change the fiscal framework when it came to power, but it chose not to. This fiscal rule ensures that when the axe is swung, it first cleaves off chunks of support for the poorest in society, hardly what you would expect from a supposedly left of centre government. The Scottish Government takes a more progressive view of social security. This £1.5 billion is the amount that the Scottish Government decides to top up over the associated block grant adjustment. The block grant adjustment is the amount of per capita funding returned to Scotland after all taxes and revenues are sent to the Treasury, and the amount matches the per capita funding in England. This adjustment for social security is not enough to support a just and functioning society in Scotland, so the extra amount is paid for by devolved taxes or taken from other areas in the Scottish budget. But these options, increasing taxes or cutting from other areas, are available to Westminster, but it chooses not to do either. It doesn't take money from one area and it doesn't raise taxes. But if you understand how government finances work, it's even worse. These are not the real options for the UK government. Every pound the UK government spends is new currency. It doesn't have to find the money like the Scottish Government must do. It can create that currency. It could mitigate all of those benefit cuts with a few keystrokes. It has a huge privilege as the currency issuer in the UK. It doesn't need to borrow those funds or earn tax revenue. That's not how government finances work. All it needs to do is to want to spend that money and then spend it. As long as that spending does not lead to a rise in inflation, it faces no financial constraints. Now, when you understand these real constraints at Westminster, something that previously seemed hard to justify when you thought the government had to find money to pay for things becomes almost criminal. It's a dereliction of duty and of care for its citizens. Now, the Scottish Government stands apart, and Scotland is a wealthier and fairer country when a higher amount of social security payments are made to families. Mitigating these policies by the Scottish Government creates clear blue water between the Scottish and the UK governments. The Labour administration in London is content to see more children remain in poverty, while the SNP wants that number to reduce. Now, as rumours continue to spread that the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves is eyeing up cuts to disability support, more mitigation might be forced onto the Scottish Government and more pain will be felt in England. The Westminster Government chooses to inflict this pain. To continue to reduce welfare payments, the government uses the shield of austerity. We can't afford to pay benefits, they say, and many people believe them. But if they can't even find the 1.5 billion that a sub-national government can find, what's the point of electing them to power? But of course they can. It's all smoke and mirrors designed to continue the wealth extraction by a tiny percentage of the population. That much must be obvious to anyone counting the shuttered up stores on their high street, waiting weeks to see their doctor, or contemplating how to find a deposit for a home. So why does no one in the mainstream economic profession or in the media want to dive any deeper on austerity in England? Why can Scotland mitigate these harsh and harmful cuts, but England can't? So how often have you heard an interviewer, economic or political commentator challenge the Labour government or the Tory one before it? Scotland spends £272 more per person on social security than Westminster. How does it do that? Just to match Scotland's social security spending, you would have to increase welfare spending by 15 billion, but still you want to cut more benefits? That would be my gentle opener. To avoid more austerity in England, the UK government must at least match social spending in Scotland. This is surely the very least that people in England should demand. Calls to reduce welfare or social security spending normally comes from ill-informed commentators and of course politicians who misunderstand how government finances work. We don't have the money, they cry, but Scotland does. I think I've proved that these cries of helplessness are nonsense. Now, economist Michael Kalecki said, opponents of such government spending, like welfare or social security, say that the government will then have nothing to show for their money. The reply is that the counterpart of spending will be the higher standard of living of the masses. Is that not the purpose of all economic activity?